Picking an emperor by handing him a piece of paper is a very strange idea when you think about it for more than 5 seconds. Somewhere in the 2nd century, the most powerful man on earth looked at a fully grown adult stranger, not his son, not his blood, sometimes barely even his friend, and said, "You're my child now. Also, you get the empire." And the strangest part isn't that it happened once. It happened 4 times in a row, on purpose, and for almost 100 years it produced some of the most competent rulers Rome ever had. Then, the moment a father actually had a real son standing in the room, the whole system quietly fell apart. So what was going on? Why would an empire built on family name, ancestor worship, and bloodline pride decide, again and again, that the safest way to choose a ruler was to legally manufacture one? There was no reformer who sat down one day and invented the adoption method as a form of government. Nobody in the Senate stood up and announced, "We are now a meritocracy." What actually happened is that a boring, everyday piece of Roman legal paperwork, the kind wealthy families used to sort out inheritance and keep an estate in the family name, got quietly repurposed, under pressure, by men who had run out of better options. And once it actually worked, it kept getting reused, refined, and eventually treated less like an emergency fix and more like a discovery. Rome had accidentally found a substitute for a hereditary king. It just didn't want to say so out loud. To understand why adoption was even sitting there, ready to be used this way, you have to understand what it meant for an ordinary Roman family, because it had almost nothing to do with orphans or charity. Roman adoption was property law wearing a family portrait. The head of a Roman household, the paterfamilias, held something called patria potestas, near total legal authority over everyone underneath him, sons included, no matter how old those sons got. A 35-year-old Roman man with children of his own could still, technically, be under his living father's legal thumb. Adoption was the tool that moved a person out of one household's authority and into another's, along with, crucially, his name, his religious obligations to the family gods, and eventually his inheritance rights. And here is the detail that makes the imperial story make sense. Wealthy Romans overwhelmingly preferred adopting adults, not children. If your bloodline was thin, if your sons had died, if you simply didn't have an heir you trusted, you didn't have to gamble on raising a baby into someone competent. You could look at a fully grown man, watch how he had already performed in public life, in the army, in politics, in his own family's affairs, and then adopt him, knowing exactly what you were getting. There were 2 versions of this. Adoptio quietly transferred a still dependent son from one father to another, a private transaction between households. Adrogatio was the bigger move, adopting a man who was already legally independent, running his own household, head of his own family line. That one wasn't private. It had to pass through the priests, who examined whether it was safe to let an entire family's religious rights simply end, and then through a public assembly, because you were about to erase one household and expand another. Notice that safeguard, because it matters later. The whole point of routing adrogatio through priests and a public vote was to stop one person from quietly rewriting an inheritance behind closed doors. And yet by the time emperors were the ones doing the adopting, that safeguard had been worn down to almost nothing, streamlined into little more than the emperor's own word, passed along with a nod from his chief priest. The one legal check built to prevent exactly this kind of quiet, unwitnessed manipulation of an inheritance turned out to be no match for a man who was also the head of state, the head of the army, and the head of the state religion, all at once. Adoption, in other words, was never sentimental in Rome. It was a formal, witnessed, legally binding decision about which grown man got to carry your name, your household gods, and your fortune into the future. Which means, by the time emperors started using it, the tool wasn't invented for them. It was just lying around, extremely well built, waiting for someone powerful enough to use it on the largest possible scale. Which raises an obvious question. Rome was not a culture that treated ancestry casually. Elite households kept wax death masks of their forefathers, paraded them through the streets at funerals, and recited family trees the way other cultures recite scripture. A Roman aristocrat's entire social standing could rest on being able to name the consuls and generals hanging in his family line. So how did a civilization this obsessed with bloodline ever get comfortable handing its household name, its ancestral gods, and eventually its throne to a man who wasn't born into it? The uncomfortable answer is that the Romans weren't choosing between blood and no blood. Adoption legally rewrote the blood. Once the paperwork went through, the adopted man's old ancestors stopped counting, and his new ones started. He inherited the wax masks, the family gods, the lineage, all of it, retroactively, as though he had been born into the house instead of recruited into it. Rome didn't invent meritocracy. It invented a legal ritual that let ancestry be assigned rather than inherited, which is a very different thing, and which meant the aristocracy never had to admit, even to itself, that it was choosing competence over blood. As far as Roman law and Roman religion were concerned, it wasn't. The first person to use it that way at the very top almost didn't mean to. Julius Caesar had no living son he considered a suitable heir, so in his will, he adopted his 18-year-old great-nephew, a slight, unimpressive-looking young man named Octavian, and left him everything. Caesar was murdered before anyone could really argue with him about it, and Octavian, suddenly and legally, was Caesar's son. He spent the next several decades turning that one piece of paper into the entire Roman Empire and the name Augustus. You would think, having personally ridden a posthumous adoption all the way to absolute power, Augustus would have built his own succession plan entirely around it. He didn't, not at first. He wanted blood. He adopted his own grandsons, groomed them, paraded them in front of the legions, and watched, one after another, as they died before they could inherit anything. Only then, old, out of better options, and increasingly desperate, did Augustus adopt his stepson Tiberius and hand him the empire. Rome's very first emperor had tried everything else first. Adoption wasn't his plan, it was what was left after his plan failed. Before we get to the men who fixed this problem, it's worth sitting for a moment with the problem itself, because Rome did not stumble into adoption out of curiosity, it stumbled into it out of exhaustion. For the first several generations after Augustus, blood mostly won, and blood, it turned out, was an extremely unreliable delivery system for competent government. Tiberius grew paranoid and reclusive, retreating to an island and letting informers terrorize the Senate in his name. His eventual successor, Caligula, is remembered for cruelty, extravagance, and a reign so unstable that his own guards eventually murdered him in a palace corridor. Nero, the last of that original bloodline, spent lavishly, purged rivals real and imagined, and died at his own hand as the empire turned against him. Skip forward a few decades, and you get Domitian, executed by conspirators inside his own bedroom because everyone around him had concluded, correctly, that killing him was safer than continuing to serve him. Hereditary succession kept producing a horrifying lottery, because biology does not care whether your son turns out to be capable or cruel, and Roman politics never developed a polite mechanism for telling an emperor's own child, actually, no, you simply waited, hoped, and occasionally reached for a knife. Which brings us to the year 96. The Emperor Domitian, deeply paranoid and widely hated by the Senate, was assassinated inside his own palace. In the panic afterward, the Senate scrambled to install someone, anyone, who looked safe, uncontroversial, and unlikely to seize total power for himself. They settled on an elderly senator named Nerva, old, respected, politically harmless, and, conveniently, without a son of his own. On paper, this looked stable. In practice, Nerva had a serious problem. He had no army loyal to him personally, and the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own soldiers, were furious that Domitian's assassins hadn't been punished. In October of the year 97, the Praetorian Guard did something extraordinary. Led by an officer named Casparius Aelianus, they surrounded the imperial palace, effectively took the emperor hostage inside his own home, and demanded he hand over the men responsible for Domitian's death. Nerva refused, at first. Then he didn't. He caved, handed over the men, and, in a detail that must have been genuinely humiliating for a Roman emperor, was reportedly forced to publicly thank the very soldiers who had just besieged him. An emperor of Rome, held hostage in his own palace by his own guard. That is not a man secure in his position. That is a man who understood, immediately and clearly, that he would not survive without serious military backing of his own, and he had none. So Nerva did the only thing available to him. He adopted Trajan, a respected general commanding loyal legions on the Rhine frontier, a man Nerva knew mostly by reputation, and made him his son, his heir, and effectively co-ruler almost overnight. This wasn't affection. This was a hostage situation resolved with a legal document. By making Trajan his adopted son, Nerva instantly attached Trajan's army, Trajan's reputation, and Trajan's loyalty to his own crumbling authority. It worked. The mutiny lost its momentum. Nerva died naturally the following year, and Trajan inherited an empire that would go on to reach its largest size in Roman history. Here is what matters. Nerva didn't set out to prove that merit beats bloodline. He set out to survive the next 6 months. But it worked, and it worked so visibly better than the chaos of hereditary succession that had come immediately before it, that the emperors who followed looked at what Nerva had accidentally stumbled into and decided to do it again. on purpose, repeatedly. Trajan expanded the empire for 2 decades, and when he lay dying far from Rome in the year 117, the succession got murky in exactly the way you would expect from a system with no formal rulebook. Trajan supposedly adopted a distant relative named Hadrian on his deathbed, supposedly. The historian Cassius Dio recorded a persistent rumor that Trajan never actually finalized the adoption at all while alive, and that his wife, the Empress Plotina, a longtime supporter of Hadrian, arranged or possibly forged the paperwork after the fact to make sure her preferred candidate took the throne. Hadrian received his official notice of adoption on the 9th of August. News of Trajan's death reached him 2 days later. Make of that timing whatever you like. Even Rome's supposedly merit-based system of choosing the best man for the job may have run, at least once, through a grieving widow's private study and a suspiciously convenient letter. Hadrian, whatever the truth of his own succession, spent the rest of his reign determined not to leave anything to chance the way Trajan seemingly had. When his first chosen heir died unexpectedly, Hadrian didn't simply pick a replacement. He picked a replacement and then dictated who that replacement would eventually adopt as well, planning 2 entire successions into the future from his own deathbed. In the year 138, Hadrian formally adopted a respected, uncontroversial senator named Antoninus, on one condition. Antoninus, in turn, had to adopt 2 young men Hadrian had personally selected, his own wife's teenage nephew, Marcus, and the young son of Hadrian's original dead heir, a boy named Lucius. One dying emperor, arranging the next 3 coronations in advance, using nothing but paperwork and the threat of disinheritance. That is not accidental improvisation anymore. That is a succession machine, deliberately engineered. Antoninus, who would later be given the title Pius, reportedly for insisting the Senate formally deify Hadrian after they initially refused, went on to rule for 23 remarkably calm, remarkably uneventful years. No wars worth remembering, no palace murders, no crises dramatic enough to survive as gossip for later historians. He balanced the treasury, kept the grain doles running, funded public building projects, and reportedly never left Italy for the entire length of his reign, governing an empire that stretched from Britain to the edge of Persia without needing to personally put out a single fire, in a system that had within living memory involved hostage-taking soldiers and a forged deathbed letter. Boring was the highest compliment Roman government could possibly receive. Then, exactly as arranged, decades earlier, Antoninus adopted his 2 designated heirs into full imperial power. When he died in the year 161, something happened that had never happened before in Roman history. Instead of 1 emperor, Rome got 2 at once, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, ruling jointly, co-equal, because that was simply what the adoption paperwork, written years earlier by a man who was already dead, had specified. 4 adoptions in a row. 4 rulers who historians would later group together and call, admiringly, the empire's best stretch of leadership. Not because they shared a bloodline, because for exactly 4 transitions in a row, nobody did. This run of 4 transitions impressed people who studied it centuries later. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing his history of Rome's decline in the 1700s, singled out this exact stretch, from Nerva through the Antonines, as the period during which the human race was, in his words, at its happiest and most prosperous. The political theorist Machiavelli made a similar point even earlier, arguing that Rome thrived precisely because these emperors were chosen for demonstrated ability rather than accident of birth. And yet it's worth noticing that this supposedly merit-based dynasty was not entirely free of blood after all. Marcus Aurelius didn't just get adopted into the family. He also married into it, taking Antoninus's own daughter, Faustina, as his wife. The adoptive succession that historians praised for escaping bloodline politics was, underneath the legal paperwork, still one increasingly intermarried household. Rome hadn't replaced family with merit. It had just widened the definition of family enough to make merit look like it belonged there. Marcus Aurelius, the last of them, is the emperor who kept a private journal of philosophy, urging himself toward duty, restraint, and putting the common good ahead of personal desire, a collection of notes we still read today as meditations. If anyone in Roman history was positioned to understand, intellectually, why the adoption system had worked so well, it was him. And when his own moment came to choose an heir, Marcus Aurelius had something none of his 3 adoptive predecessors ever had while making that decision: a living biological son. He picked him anyway. In the year 180, Marcus Aurelius died and was succeeded not by an adopted man of proven competence, chosen from the empire's entire talent pool, but by his own son, Commodus, a young man whose reign historians would later describe, with considerable understatement, as an unfortunate choice. The gladiatorial obsessions, the paranoia, the political instability that followed, are usually treated as the moment Rome's most stable century quietly came to an end. Which is the uncomfortable part of this whole story. The adoption system was never really a philosophy. It wasn't Rome discovering, and nobly committing to, the idea that merit should outrank blood. It worked, every single time, specifically because the emperor doing the choosing didn't have a biological son standing in the room to compete with the idea. Nerva had no son. Trajan, as far as the sources tell us, had no son. Hadrian never had a biological son at all, only that first adopted heir who died before him. Antoninus had no surviving sons of his own when he adopted Marcus and Lucius. For 4 straight successions in a row, Rome got to look principled entirely because nobody holding the power to choose was ever actually forced to choose between his own child and the best available man. The moment that finally happened, the answer arrived almost instantly, and it was not the philosophical one. You can still see the same tension play out today, minus the togas. Family businesses talk endlessly about bringing in outside professional leadership, hiring the most qualified candidate, building a proper board and a proper succession plan, right up until the founder's own child is old enough to take the corner office. Plenty of companies do eventually choose the outsider. Plenty more discover, at the crucial moment, that the founder wanted his kid running the place all along, and that the talk of merit was sincere only for as long as it cost nothing. Rome ran that exact experiment on the scale of an empire, 4 times in a row, and it took exactly 1 emperor with an actual son to reveal which value had really been in charge the entire term. So the next time you hear historians describe Rome's adoptive emperors as proof that a great civilization can learn to choose its leaders on merit instead of blood, remember what actually happened the one time an adopting emperor had a real alternative sitting at his own dinner table. For 4 generations, Rome quietly convinced itself that the chair chose the best man for the job. The 5th time, a father had an actual son standing in the room, and the whole idea, it turned out, was never really a philosophy at all. It was just a family that had gotten unusually lucky, 4 times in a row, about not having children of its own.